Welcome, everyone. This lecture is to introduce you to the study of art history, to give you a basic kind of understanding of what that entails, the different methods by which we engage art historically, and yeah, let's jump in. So the central aim of art history is to determine the original context of artworks. So that means that we treat these works of art as if they were a source in and of themselves. We treat them as like any other historical document. If you were to use a written source that you cited in a paper, you cite an object the same way. So I feel like that's pretty straightforward. That's a very simplified definition, but it works. So art historians seek to achieve a full understanding of why these quote unquote persisting events, of human history look the way they do, why they were created, why, basically, all of that. So, we describe these objects as persisting events because they're still with us in the sense that they were created and we can still experience them today, not necessarily in the same manner because we're in a different context, looking with different eyes, but they're still with us. So in that way, it's persistent. So we can't really have the study of art history without history, right? So art history is really an indispensable tool when it comes to understanding history and how it's reflected back to us, and vice versa. So they're both very integral to each other. And in a way that distinguishes art objects from other types of historical documents, uh, and not that historical documents can't give us a peek into the past and what it was like for other people, but those are much rarer when we're talking about the entire scheme of the art historical record on this planet, really up until, written language really kind of cements itself. And even then we have written languages we can't read, right? So there are still ways to deduce things when we can't necessarily read the language. And this also gives us insight in ways that just some kind of written account wouldn't. So artists and architects, art makers in general, creatives really at large, because art encompasses a lot of different things and it's a constantly changing definition. So in terms of their role in society, artists and architects can serve a few different functions, if we want to think of it that way. They can aid and abet and reinforce cultural values, reinforce the status quo through their artwork, or if they have issue with something, they may incorporate that into their artwork and serve as a facilitator of discussion via the artwork that they create to try to start challenging some of the cultural norms that they might find problematic. So, as we can kind of see, art history and history are very, very interlinked while still being distinct, and each is needed to get really a full picture of what's going on. And even then, we're just doing our best, right? Okay, so this is a great little video by Ted Ed about the history of religion and art. It's very short. All right.
It's only been the last few hundred years or so that Western civilization has been putting art in museums. At least museums resembling the public institutions we know today. Before this, for most, art served other purposes. What we call fine art today was in fact primarily how people experienced an aesthetic dimension of religion. Paintings, sculpture, textiles, and illuminations were the media of their time, supplying vivid imagery to accompany the stories of the day. In this sense, Western art shared a utilitarian purpose with other cultures around the world, some of whose languages, incidentally, have no word for art. So how do we define what we call art? Generally speaking, what we're talking about here is work that visually communicates meaning beyond language, either through representation or the arrangement of visual elements in space. Evidence of this power of iconography, or ability of images to convey meaning, can be found in abundance if we look at art from the histories of our major world religions. Almost all have, at one time or another in their history, gone through some sort of aniconic phase. Aniconism prohibits any visual depiction of the divine. This is done in order to avoid idolatry, or confusion between the representation of divinity and divinity itself, keeping it real, so to speak, in the relationship between the individual and the divine. However, this can be a challenge to maintain, given that the urge to visually represent and interpret the world around us is a compulsion difficult to suppress. For example, even today, where the depiction of Allah or the Prophet Muhammad is prohibited, an abstract celebration of the divine can still be found in arabesque patterns of Islamic textile design, or the masterful flourishes of brushwork in Arabic calligraphy, where the words of the Prophet assume a dual role as both literature and visual art. Likewise, in art from the early periods of Christianity and Buddhism, the divine presence of the Christ and the Buddha do not appear in human form, but are represented by symbols. In each case, iconographic reference is employed as a form of reverence. Anthropomorphic representation, or depiction in human form, eventually became widespread in these religions only centuries later, under the influence of the cultural traditions surrounding them. Historically speaking, the public appreciation of visual art in terms other than traditional religious or social function is a relatively new concept. Today, we fetishize the fetish, so to speak. We go to museums to see art from the ages, but our experience of it there is drastically removed from the context in which it was originally intended to be seen. It might be said that the modern viewer lacks the richness of engagement that she has with contemporary art, which has been created relevant to her time and speaks her cultural language. It might also be said that the history of what we call art is a conversation that continues on as our contemporary present passes into what will be some future generation's classical past. It's a conversation that reflects the ideologies, mythologies, belief systems, and taboos, and so much more of the world in which it was made. But this is not to say that work from another age made to serve a particular function in that time is dead or has nothing to offer the modern viewer. Even though, in a museum setting, works of art from different places and times are presented alongside each other, isolated from their original settings, their juxtaposition has benefits. Exhibits are organized by curators, or people who've made a career out of their ability to recontextualize or remix cultural artifacts in a collective presentation. As viewers, we're then able to consider the art in terms of a common theme that might not be apparent in a particular work, until you see it alongside another, and new meanings can be derived and reflected upon. If we're so inclined, we might even start to see every work of art as a complementary part of some undefined, unified whole of past human experience, a trail that leads right to our doorstep and continues on with us, open to anyone who wants to explore it.
All right. So there you go. There's that one. So let's go back to the lecture. Okay. For the next part of this, which is, breaking this down a little bit more, right? Okay. So at the most base level here, if we have to define art, right? This is really the most generic way to do it because this is always changing. So art is material culture, which means visual or tangible objects that humans make and the structures that they built. This includes historically, and once again, this is always in flux, right? With the advent of technology, it's always in flux. So the typical ones are architecture, sculpture, the pictorial arts, which are basically the 2D arts. You have the addition of the craft arts or the arts of design later on getting elevated to the level of fine art, whereas before they were kind of just seen in some cultural contexts as being kind of less than quote-unquote fine art, but we'll talk about that more. And then obviously you have all kinds of different multimedia, and it's expanding every day. So like I mentioned, this definition is constantly changing as our world evolves and advances. So some of the newer aspects of art making include computer-generated images. Obviously, we have performance art that factors in here. The dance arts, music, those count too. unintended art, right? Things that we look at now and quote unquote call art, but maybe they were really just functional objects at the time, and they might have been embellished with art. Um, but that's why we call it unintended, because it wasn't necessarily meant to be heralded as like the epitome of fine artistic endeavor, but we do tend to personalize our things, right? We think about drawing on our notebooks or whatever, you know. Now sketchbooks are a big thing to collect of artists, and that's, you know, kind of an unintended art, but we're fascinated by process, so they're very illuminating. We also have the addition of quote unquote found object art with the Dadaists, and we'll talk about Duchamp's fountain here. Now, we need to be aware that we are each allowed to have different likes and dislikes. That's the wonderful thing about art. We are allowed to have different tastes. So here's some examples of here's a coin. So unintended art. Coin is a little less unintended art, right? Because obviously they choose the designs very purposefully. But still, you know, maybe a bowl would be a better example or something. Found object art. This is the canon example here of Marcel Duchamp's The Fountain. He literally just took a urinal and flipped it a different way and then signed it with his artist pseudonym Armut. And this is definitely a troll of the art world. And we won't get too far into the Dadaists, but they're quite fascinating. So when you're looking at an art historical textbook, right, you might wonder to yourself, how in the heck does the textbook decide what is the best example of these cultures, right? And first of all, right, we're working with what we have. So in no way are we ever saying this is all that was ever made, right? That's ridiculous. It's preposterous. We can only go on what we have left. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't more. We just need to keep that in mind. So how do we choose these kind of exemplary examples? We choose them based on which ones most exemplify the cultural values based on the designated period or the style. And this is still very arbitrary, right? It's all contextually specific. So we'll talk about more how to discern context here shortly. And remember, obviously, sometimes things cross categorical labels, right? Some things can be more than one thing. Now, as you'll notice in most textbooks, it's very heavily bent towards Western art. What do we mean by Western art? We'll get into that. But it's in the gist of it is it's the art forms that descend out of the classical world of Greece and Rome, right? That go on later to influence Europe and then America. So why do we focus so heavily on Western art in like just a typical art history class? Well, it's because we're in the Western world, right? And unfortunately, the Western world has Western bias. And it's weird to refer to it as the West, right? But if we think about it in from the old world perspective, you know, the Americas being the quote unquote new world, that is the West, right? And we don't really refer to Europe, at least the western part of Europe, as the East, because it's still technically part of the West. So when we talk about non-Western art, we're talking about basically everything else, and that's a lot of different things. So we'll get into that though. And obviously, you know, time constraints. We only have so much time when you're taking a course, and my goal here is really to frame it up so that you guys know how to pursue a lot of this on your own. You can pursue what interests you the most. So if you talk about break it down, Western versus non-Western, what the hell does that mean? So Western culture, like I mentioned, models itself after these classical traditions that come out of Greece and Rome. They influence Western Europe and North America once those European explorers, colonists, however you want to refer to them, come over. Right? And then we have this other like umbrella lump for everything else. Which so these generalizations are very oversimplified, and increasingly quote unquote Western artists are looking towards non-Western art, right, as we rediscover our cultural identities and incorporate those into modern art, or where we're at now is really like postmodern art. But we have to keep this Western bias in mind. It is unavoidable. So when obviously we live in a visual world, and if you are a sighted person, so let's say if you're not a sighted person, it's a little different. But for generalization's sake, we live in a visual world. "Quote unquote" art is everywhere, right? You can really consider anything art. Being visually literate is important to being alive and staying alive, right? If you don't know what a red light means, you're gonna have issues probably. So this increase in what we call visual acumen, or being able to read your world, and when you're in your particular cultural context, you can do that. It's more easy for you to read the cultural messages and communications that are coming at you. If you were in a different cultural context, it would be different, right? So the skill of observation that we cultivate within art historical study is a skill that you can use anywhere, right? And it's actually, the study of art is actually becoming a very integral part of a lot of other STEM studies, because they're beginning to recognize this. So this is a really great video out of Harvard Med School, I believe, about how this all kind of links together. Here we go.
Bringing art into medicine is really important because it's not just all the science. We need to train our young doctors to teach them compassion, and art is a beautiful mechanism to do that. It works on many levels. They're each observing. To be a good doctor, you have to be very observant the minute you walk in the room. What is the look on the person's face in the painting? What is their body language? Really sort of grapple with what they're seeing and what it could mean. And then we talk about different ways to look at compassion. We bring in how that's so important in medicine.
You'd think that arts and humanities are very far from medicine and science, but actually it's all part of one continuum. We as doctors are looking for beauty and helping patients to find their balance again and find their beauty. The more that we help our medical students and our pre-meds to practice that skill, and the more that we help our artists think about pain in others, it helps them to enhance their art as well.
Art does help you look for things as a doctor in many different levels. For dermatology, for example, those are all patterns and pattern recognition. It helps you to look at the details, to stop a moment and reflect, and to really observe what you're seeing, and to think about it.
Right. Short and sweet. Short and sweet. I love it. Okay, let's get back to the lecture. So, and actually, building on this, we actually have the acronym STEAM, right, instead of STEM. And it's reflective of the inclusion of the arts within that acronym. So, I've included a handout in the supplemental materials and the attachments for this lecture, and this is one of them, the questions art historians ask. And these obviously are not the only questions, but these are great initial questions, kind of the who, what, where, when, and why, to get your inquiry started, right? Usually these questions lead to more questions. That's how it goes. So the first question we start asking is, how old is it, right? And we can approach this a couple of different ways. We have exact dates, approximate dates, relative dates, depending on how old something is, depending on if it's carbon-based or if it's stone. We can't carbon date something that doesn't contain carbon. So some of the ways that we do these things is by dating physical evidence, if it's material that can be dated. Now, in the later periods, we have documentary evidence, like records or like journal entries are sometimes a good example of this, where they talk about the art or the creation process, or they reference it somewhere. And these are very valuable, but we just don't have a lot of them. Internal evidence is another way to date something if you have no other way of doing it. And this is heavily kind of subjective, but there is a way to do it. stylistic evidence can be used, but this is once again a little bit more subjective. But when we have nothing else to go on, we kind of just have to work with what we have. So another question, what is its style? And we can once again approach this from a few different avenues, right? We can talk about it in terms of period style, if it was created within a certain artistic movement or period, if we know that, and that's a little bit more specific. We can discuss it as part of a regional style, which is more geographic based and sometimes have time limits, but it's a little bit more general and we don't have to be as exact. Personal style is another one, right? Just your artistic uniqueness. And in some cultures, artistic uniqueness is not encouraged, especially in some of the prehistoric cultures where things needed to fit within a certain formula to uphold the cultural values. The next question is, what is its subject, right? Literally, what is depicted? If it's something that's non-figurative art, if it's abstract art, you may not be able to answer that, right? You have to approach it a little bit differently. But in general, these are kind of the subject genres here. We've got religious art, historical art, mythological art, what we call genre scenes, which are really just kind of depictions of daily life, like just the normal everyday person, not someone that's like a quote-unquote celebrity or a leader or anything like that. Portraiture, obviously. Landscape is another one. Still life is sometimes considered a genre scene as well. You might hear referred to that. And then another way to get at the subject matter is through the study of iconography and symbolism. Now, iconography is similar to symbolism, but it incorporates a few more layers. So, iconographic study, and this is once if we think about that root of icon, right? The depiction of a figure that's revered for some reason. That's a pretty good base definition here. So iconography is this branch of art history that studies the identification, description, and interpretation of the content of images. And I know that's kind of confusing. It'll become clearer as we kind of go through some examples. So iconography studies the subjects depicted, how they're depicted, through different compositional techniques that we know of, and in this approach, we interpret everything as being significant, that everything has a reason. An artist made this choice for a reason, right? And we're just kind of decoding it. Sometimes that's not true. With the later art movements, sometimes you just do it, but when we have the source, right? When we can go to the horse's mouth, when we can ask the artist, it's helpful. But we don't get that opportunity very often. Way more often than not, there's no communication with whoever the creator is, if we even can identify them. So iconography also includes the study of symbols. So symbology is kind of included in iconography, but iconography is a wider scope, takes in a wider scope than just symbology. So like I said, this word iconography, it stems from the Greek word icon, meaning image, and then graphia, meaning to write. All right, so let's look at some different examples of iconography just real quick. So we've got 3 different examples here from different cultural contexts. We have the top left example being an Egyptian example, but even with it being an Egyptian example, because Egypt has such a long history and goes through a variety of phases with its style, even you kind of have to dive in even deeper, right? So you got to know which culture you're talking about, okay? We have this bottom left here. This is a female personification panel. I believe this is Athena. Oh no, it wouldn't be Athena in this case. It would be, because it's Roman. I need to restudy my equivalencies. But anyway, basically the HBIC here. So this is from the Arapacis Augusti. So this is from the Augustan era of Rome, which will dictate how you analyze it because that is your context. On the right, we have a nice illuminated manuscript example here, a page depicting the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And their associated animal symbols are here as well. And this is early Christian art. So look at it, it's 810. So fairly early. So when you start looking at a work of art, you have to keep the context in which it was created in mind. You have to. You absolutely have to. That's the only way to get even, and accurate. It's an objective term once again. But this idea that we're going to be able to analyze things through our eyes without putting ourselves where the creator was, it's rife with erroneousness. Okay, so the next one is who made it, right? If you're lucky, you'll have a signature. More often than not, many of these objects that we herald as the epitome of cultural achievement, we don't even know who made it. And in some cultural contexts, it didn't matter. In other cultural contexts, the artist kind of functioned as celebrity, especially later on in history. As opposed to earlier on in history, artists just kind of functioning as an arm of the state. Sometimes we can attribute things based on style. Sometimes we have like a letter or a journal entry that'll mention something in passing, and we're lucky enough to catch it, and we're like, oh my God, there it is. That's who made it. Now we know. It's rare though. It's pretty rare. In terms of like prehistoric art, this just doesn't happen. But more often than not, we don't ever know who created it, and it's just a mystery. We can attribute it to the culture and maybe the time period and the region, but sometimes that's as close as we can get. Who paid for it, right? That's the next one, because that's going to make a big difference in how something appears. And if it's something that an artist just made, like of their own accord, they just wanted to make it, you interpret an object like that a little bit differently than something that was commissioned by a patron, right? Because they may have certain ideas in mind that they want to incorporate that the artist then works, within those parameters. And also, right, if we think about state commissioned art, which tends to serve propagandistic purposes for the rulers, you're gonna analyze that a lot different than a piece of art that someone just made straight from the heart for whatever reason, right? Who is paying for it? That's a big one. Or who commissioned it? So these are some like kind of secondary questions that you'll probably be led to after these initial ones. Why was the work created? Was it commissioned? Was it just the artist just decided it? Was it a work of architecture that was for a purpose, right? Like these are all questions we begin asking. Was the method or technique used to create it intentional? And sometimes, obviously it's intentional because the artist decided to do it, but sometimes there's more intention than other times, right? Sometimes there's just like, I just like that color. Like does not always a significance there, right? We can read too deep into things sometimes. And then the last one here listed is why was it created to look a particular way? Or why was it done in a particular style? Artists are not confined to working in one style, which is why stylistic attribution can be risky, because an artist can change their style. That doesn't mean they still didn't make it. Picasso is a great example of that. Okay. So one aspect of art historical study is formal analysis. And the goal of this particular process is to explain how the formal elements of a work of art affect the representation of the subject matter and expressive content. And we're going to talk about how to even begin doing that, right? Because we got to have some sort of frame of reference from which to operate from, right? We need some terminology, and that's coming. Don't worry. So when you're doing a formal analysis, the emphasis of what you're discussing is more on the formal qualities. You're actually not interpreting it iconographically or symbolically. It's just based on how it looks. And cultural context does factor in here, but you're not diving as deeply into it, right? It's an aesthetic evaluation. But then to complete the formal analysis, you generally do put a little bit, of cultural context in there, right? Just to frame it for your reader. So here are some words that art historians use. These are known as the elements of art and the principles of design. And depending on whose list you look at, there might be different ones there, but they all kind of encompass the same thing. Sometimes certain lists have like two terms for almost the same kind of thing, but it just really depends on where you look. So the elements themselves are the foundational cornerstones of the artwork. And the principles really augment the elements. if that makes sense. It's how you kind of decorate the elements of art. So we're going to get into these one by one, and I have included a couple of nice video links. This guy, I think he's a middle school art teacher, but I'm going to let y'all watch those on your own because they're a little longer, and we're going to kind of go over it after this anyway. But if you want like a different take on it, sometimes it's helpful to hear a few different people explain it, and he does a very good job because he's for middle schoolers, so it's great. So here's the one for elements of art. And you can follow that link. It's still active. I just checked. And then here's the one for the principles of design. And that link is also still active. It's the same person. Okay, so we also are going to be using a few other terms for formal analysis here. Some of these aren't on the list of elements and principles proper, but they factor in here. So we're just going to jump right in and go through these one by one. All right. When we talk about form, right, we just talked about formal analysis. What is its form? How is it created? What forms does it take, right? So in art, the form is made up of the shape, the structure, whether it's 2D or 3D. When we talk about composition, we're talking about the ways in which an artist organizes the forms in the artwork. So how do they organize the elements and principles of design? How do they utilize that? And that's going to vary from 2D to 3D. So we have a good example here of a 2D example by Jacques-Louis David from the neoclassical period, Oath of the Horatii. And Jacques-Louis David was like a master of the rule of thirds here once we kind of figured out what that was and that our human mind really liked things that were composed that way. So we see here lots of triples, really. So we've got like the 3 arches that frame each kind of set of characters here. This is the father of these 3 sons that are about to go to war. This is basically kind of like the Hatfields and McCoys of this. This is actually a Roman, I believe it's a Roman subject matter, but it's been painted by a Frenchman, Jacques-Louis David, in the neoclassical period. And then here we have this nice kinetic mobile by Alexander Calder. I think this is in the National Gallery. I think that's where this is. But because this is 3D and it's literally hanging from the ceiling like a mobile, just like a kid's, baby mobile that you'd hang over the crib, it actually moves. Like when the AC kicks on, it moves a little bit. But composition here is in how he has balanced things, right? And how he's kind of directing your eye through it. And they do that here too. Louis David does it here, kind of through, and there's a few different ways you can approach it, but your eye kind of is led here, up here, through here, and then you descend back down to these poor women who are the wives of these men, and the men that these men are going to fight are the brothers of these women. Oh. Yeah, it's a pretty juicy story, actually. Okay, so when we refer to medium, or sometimes we say media, this is just the material that the artist used to work, like their preferred medium. So this can be anything, like literally basically anything at this point in history. And we have this nice photo of Jackson Pollock here working in his studio, and he worked in a very non-traditional way. Actually, he used non-traditional materials. We see him using a can of house paint here. And this is part of the reason why he was kind of revolutionary in abstract expressionism, because of how he created his art. So his technique and his medium was just kind of new. Well, new to the art world, at least. So the techniques are the processes that they use, how they use the medium. And the technique it can be very personal, or it can be more of kind of an academically reinforced technique. And when we talk about line, really the most base definition of a line is really just the extension of a point, right? You put your pen down on the paper, that's the point, and then you move it, and that's the line. And you make this concrete. There are no true lines in nature, right? There's really not. There's implied lines where 2 things kind of meet. But the idea of a drawn line is really kind of not really, it's not something we see in nature, but it is something we have to do to recreate what we see in nature. And we have a few different types of line. We have contour lines, ground lines, horizon lines. There's a few different ones. And this is a really nice linear work by Richard Serra that I've always really liked. And we can see how he's really kind of simplified the color palette here just with monochromatic black and white. But even between these 5 panels, they're all slightly different, right? Just utilizing a curved line. That's it. When we talk about color, and color theory in art is a bit different than color theory within optics or like the study of physics, and I'll kind of point out the differences here as we go. But when we talk about color, we're talking about the value or the tonality of the color, the degree of lightness and darkness, how intense or saturated it is, how pure the pigment is if it's been mixed with other pigments, that factors in there, how bright it is, how dull it is. And down here we have this nice color spectrum here going from white, slowly adding blue here until we get to the most saturated example that we see here. And colors are classified, there's 3 main categorizations, right? And I think most of us are familiar with this. This idea of primary colors being red, yellow, and blue, those colors that you cannot mix. You have to go out and get those colors, period. You can't make blue with anything else. You have to go get the blue, right? And that's why a lot of these pigments that we see, especially in ancient art, are these pigments, right? Because they understood that every other color comes from these. So when we look at secondary colors, these are the combinations of the primary colors. Here, we'll just go to the color wheel. Okay, so here we are. And we also have this term, let me go back here, complementary colors, right? And in art, these are colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. So they're kind of like the polar opposites of each other, but for whatever reason, they complement each other really nicely. So like a lot of sports teams or like even holidays like Christmas is red and green. If we go back here, they're right across from each other. And here, this is a nice, another category here of tertiary colors. So the colors that fall between the primaries and the secondaries, right? And they're just named really conveniently, right? Red and violet for between red, violet. But this is how it functions. When we talk about texture, we're really talking about the quality of a surface. And this can be a completely illusionary, I'm sorry, a completely illusionary of texture, right? Because if we look at this work by Titian down here, the man with a quilted sleeve, this is a painting. Yet, if it looks like if you reached out and touched his sleeve that you would really feel that, right? It's just so well depicted. So artists that are really good at depicting texture are really masters of illusion. It's amazing. And then we have, a little bit more actual texture in the sense that if we reach out and touch this rock, we're going to feel that it's 3D. But please don't touch the artwork, obviously. But even the juxtaposition of like the smoothness of her face versus the roughness of the outer part here, what's assuming her hair, right? That could have significance, right? The juxtaposition of this. So texture really requires light. You can't discern texture without being able to see the gradation of light to shadow. When we talk about space in art, depending on 3D or whether it's 3D or 2D, we kind of discuss it differently. In the sense of 2D, throughout time we've developed what we call systems of linear perspective, where we're able to approximate how something looks to our eye in terms of like receding space pretty well if you follow the formula. In 3D, it's actually in our space, so it's obviously easier. Our eye doesn't have to do any tricks. So this is the Annunciation scene by Fra Angelico. This is anytime you see Annunciation, it's referring to when the angel appears to the Virgin Mary within Christian mythology to tell her she's going to have a child. That's an Annunciation scene. It's a recurring theme in Christian art. So when we talk about space, we're talking about the actual area an object occupies, right? Like the dimensions. Even a 2D work of art will have dimensions, right? Length and width, if it's in a frame, or height, width, depth. So even a 2D work will have 3D components. But yeah, in 2D work, we have more of an illusionistic depiction of space than obviously something that's in our space in 3D. So in terms of 3D, and we can discuss these terms within 2D too, in terms of how the artist depicts it, right? Mass is, within architecture or sculpture, the bulk, the density, or the weight of matter in space. So it doesn't have to be solid. So what we're talking about here in application, if we're talking about like a building, the mass of the building would be the outside of it that you see, right? Whereas the volume would be the interior. So the volume, we define it as the space that mass organizes, divides, or encloses. So in architecture, it's a little bit easier to kind of conceive of this. It's a little harder in other types of art. But yeah, it's just how much space it actually takes up. And this can be perceived space, right? If it's 2D. So I mentioned linear perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about it now without getting too in depth because it gets complicated. But perspective is a method of presenting an illusion of the 3D world on a 2D surface. So when we talk about linear perspective, this is the most common type of mechanism by which to do this. And in this system, all parallel lines or surface edges converge onto, you can do 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, or 3-point perspective. And those points serve as vanishing points that all of these lines will go back and meet at. And this renders objects that are further away, they look smaller. But there's different types of perspective. We also have the method of atmospheric or aerial perspective that creates the illusion of distance by diminishing the color the further away you are. And it also tends to add this like blue kind of haze as you get farther away. So if you think about like when you're driving in your car and you see a mountain off in the distance, right? It's kind of hazy, but as you get closer, right, it becomes less hazy. This is the effect that they're emulating here, and it's a way of depicting space and giving that illusion of space, right? And diminution is another way to do this. And you can use diminution without the other two, but diminution is definitely kind of a part of the other two. And this is a great example because this example uses all 3 types, actually. So we have linear perspective here with the sun, right, being the vanishing point. So if we look at the lines that dictate how this space is structured, all of these lines lead right back to the sun. That's the vanishing point. And for this to function well, you also have to have a horizon line. So you have to have the horizontal so that you can adjust the size of things. So in terms of aerial perspective, this barge out here is a great example because it's farther away, they made it smaller, so we get that sense, right? It's also a little hazier. We get the same thing with the boats, right? We have this boat right in front of us. Maybe it's a smaller boat than this one, but it's hard to tell because this one's a little bit further away. But even this line here too, like this line that goes along the edges here goes straight back here. All of them do, actually, like if you look at this one. And they're supposed to. So you always have straight horizontals that will line up your diagonals here. So what was the other example? Oh, that's it. Okay, yeah. We got linear, aerial, and then diminution of size. This is perfect. Hits all 3 in one. The term for shortening is a little harder to explain. So sometimes, for the sake of depiction, an artist will alter the size of a particular part of the composition unnaturally, but it's for perspective purposes. So this is a good example, the Dead Christ by Andrea Mantegna. Here, he's actually foreshortened the feet and made them look really small compared to like that. When you consider that as the viewer, that's the closest part you're standing to. But if he had made them bigger, it would have kind of impeded being able to see all this nice drapery. So what we've got going on here is actually a tilted up plane. He's kind of tilted it up towards you as opposed to depicting it fully flat. And that was once again an artistic choice. So it affects the angle of vision, foreshortening does. And it's usually for artistic purpose. There's usually a reason. They don't just do it willy-nilly. When we talk about proportion, this is the relationship of the parts of persons, buildings, or objects, which is often based on a unit of measurement or a module. So within the classical world especially, you have these systems of proportion, right? The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence. And this is how they kind of dictated how the human form should appear and how they were able to, quote unquote, perfect, the depiction of naturalistic form. They had these systems of modules, right? So this is much more what we would call naturalistically proportionate. And even, from artist to artist, like this is Polyclitus's canon versus Lysippus's canon. Lysippus preferred more slender athletes, whereas Polyclitus, liked him a little beefier. So his proportional system is a little different. So even within these standards, if it was allowed, you could have, artistic aberration. And then we have, things that have humorous proportion where, like this bobblehead, like his head is obviously not in proper proportion to his body. When we talk about proportion and scale, it's easy to kind of interchange them. But it's better to, it simplifies it to think about proportion as being relative to each figure contained in and of itself, right? Just this one figure. And then when we consider scale, we would look at how that figure looks compared to the other figures that are around it. So this is an African example from Benin. And we have the Oba, who was kind of, quote unquote, the chief of the village here. And we have a technique in art called hierarchy or hierarchical scale, or the hierarchy of scale, where the more important figures in the artwork are depicted as bigger and the less important figures will be depicted smaller. So we have a good example of that here, where we have the Oba being the largest figure that insinuates his importance, surrounded by others that maybe look like children. They might not actually be children. They might just be how they're referencing the differences in the hierarchy. All right. If we get into 3D a little bit more here, if we talk about sculpture, there are two different types of sculptural processes, and then a variety of methods within each of those. So a subtractive sculptural process takes material out from the original mass. So you're carving and moving material out. Subtractive. In an additive process, you're building up materials. And like the simplest explanation or example of this would be like those little coil pots that we make, as kids, where we roll out the little coil and put it around the bottom and then you add them on. So it's a build-up process. Kind of like 3D printing, if you guys are familiar with that, as opposed to carving it out from one big block. You're building material up instead. When we describe sculpture as freestanding, or you might hear it called in the round, that just means that a sculpture was created to be looked at from all sides. And not all sculpture is. And relief sculpture is one example of this. So a relief sculpture is generally on a panel that's attached to something else. We see a lot of this in like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Those are all relief carvings. And now there are different types of relief. Relief meaning how much certain parts of the artwork project out or sink in comparison to other parts of the artwork. So we have high relief, we have low relief, which is also called bas relief, or you have and sunken relief. And in sunken relief, it's almost a reverse process where you're carving into it. Let's look at some examples. So here we have what we'd call low relief or bas relief, because he just juts out just slightly from the surface, right? He's not real popping out at you like these guys are, right? And these ones are carved with such a high degree of relief that it's almost like they were sculpted separately and then attached, but they aren't. And then we have an example of sunken relief here, another, once again, Akhenaten and Nefertiti here. So sunken relief is like here where they've carved it out, right, to distinguish it from other parts of the composition. So it kind of, it burrows in, but it also pops out a bit. So it's like kind of a combination. When we're trying to describe art, a lot of times we're tempted to use the term realistic art to describe something that's really close to nature. And it's a little bit better in this context to use the term naturalism because there's actually an art movement called realism, so it can get kind of confusing. And it doesn't have anything to do with naturalistic depiction actually. So when you're talking about something and it's really like it looks like a photograph or something, the term hyper-realistic is a bit more associated with naturalism, but the term realism is confusing to people. So naturalism. This is when the style of the artwork is based on close observation of the natural world. When this is the core of the classical tradition, right? Depicting things as we see them and figuring out how to do that. We also have what we call stylization, which is when you there's a few different forms of it, but one way of doing it is to simplify elements of the composition or parts of the composition for ease of depiction, right? And sometimes that takes away from the naturalistic impression that we can get from it, but sometimes it doesn't. So this is a good example. So if we look at these two examples of animation, this is much more stylized, right? People don't actually look like this in real life. This is a cartoon. That's what we're talking about. Stylization, like simplifying things for the ease of depiction. Now, this is also an animation here, but it's much more naturalistic. Maybe not, isn't? Who knows? Who knows? Oh God, I didn't mean to make that joke. But I think you see what I mean here, right? Like this is still animated, but it's much more naturalistic to how we really appear versus this. All right. Now, within the realm of naturalism, we have this kind of stylization called idealism, right? So when we depict something as an ideal version, and generally, a lot of the classical sculptures are very idealized. They're naturalistic, but they're like the epitome of the example of a human, right? They're like the most perfect version. So that's what we're kind of talking about here. It's the idealization of a lot of these figures and the way they're depicted. It gives a sense of what the societal standards of beauty were. And that varies from culture to culture. Some cultures value different things, right? So, Ron Mueck, these artworks are so creepy. I'm sorry, I usually don't comment if it's negative, but they are kind of creepy. This is kind of creepy. Okay, so realism as a defined term, it can be, like I said, if you use the term hyper-realistic, that's a little more specific. If you say realistic, someone might think you're talking about the art movement realism out of revolutionary France, and it's just not the same. So be cautious using this term. It's not wrong, but it can be confusing depending. So like I said, realism also refers to an artistic movement that began in France in the 1850s, right after the Revolution. And why they call it realism is because these artists were seeking to depict real-life people. Like, if we look at this example here, the third-class wagon, these are just everyday people. These aren't queens. These aren't kings. These aren't nobility. These are people literally on a third-class wagon that he is depicting. And let me tell you, that was scandalous as hell because the elevation of the common man as something worthy of artistic depiction was very controversial. But it reflects the larger value shift, especially in France after the revolution, towards the people, towards democracy, or that's the lip service, right? And there is no idealization here, to go back. They're just as they are, right? This lady's nursing, right? Just going on about their business. Another thing we need to talk about is the dating terminology I'm going to be using. And they are equivalent to AD and BC, but within the social sciences, we tend to try to take the religious component out of it, right? BC, before Christ, AD after death or whatever. So we use BCE for BC, which stands for before the Common Era, which is just 0. And then we use CE, Common Era, in place of AD. So, but they're exactly the equivalent. If I say 100 CE, I mean 100 AD. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna just kind of breeze through this here because we're not gonna do too in depth of an analysis, but I just want to kind of show you guys how formal analysis kind of works in practice. Oh, this is a good one. So here we have a nice example of a relief sculpture, right? This is fairly low relief, but also you can use relief to depict perspective too, and to add a sense of depth. So, like for instance, these guys are a little bit in lower relief than some of the things that are meant to be more right in your field of vision, closer to you, that are in higher relief. It's an interesting visual effect. So in terms of analyzing this with the elements and principles of design, and I also included attachments. It's the Getty Foundation's list of elements and principles of designs as an attachment for this post too. So those are there for you for quick ease of reference. And I also uploaded a sheet. It's like emotions and feelings vocabulary, because that's helpful. We tend to speak about our feelings in a very generic ways, and when specificity could really help us out a lot. And when analyzing art, it's important. So here, what's the medium? We're working with stone. It's a carving. We don't have any color here to analyze because either it's shawl chipped off or there was no color in the first place, so we can't really distinguish it there. We could definitely talk about it in terms of line and geometric shape and movement, right? There's a lot going on here, a lot of linear direction in terms of how your eye kind of moves throughout the scene. And then if we were going to jump into the art historical context, this is from the Assyrian culture. And this act of line hunting is a recurring theme throughout art history too. It's just like this, and I'm sure they did literally do this. And then later on in Rome in the Colosseum, you have like the lion and wild animal fights and stuff too. But what we're seeing here is a depiction of the domination of man over nature and some of the fiercest aspects of nature, right? All right, this is a cool one. So this is a depiction of St. Matthew from the Ebo Gospels, which are Carolingian, meaning coming out of the dynasty of Charlemagne in the medieval period. And this is really unusual for the time period. There's like this really frenetic energy that animates this, right? It's almost like when you drink too much coffee and you're just buzzing, right? But this was intentional. And I don't think we have the artist for this manuscript proper. A lot of times if they were produced in the monastery, sometimes it was done by like lesser assistants, and they didn't necessarily get to put their names on it. But yeah, we see him here just kind of like writing in this frenzy. He's like, and the impression is that he's animated with this mania of divine godly energy, because to write, he's writing, he's just writing and writing and writing. And Matthew obviously is a very important figure in Judeo-Christian tradition, and we have his symbol of the evangelist up here as well, kind of hiding. But this really linear, like wiggly take, it's extremely unusual. And the colors are pretty typical of the time period. But yeah, this line work is really interesting. And if we note, right, like, and in the other example that we looked at too, the other four evangelist example, they look very classical, right? They look like they're like from Greece and Rome. So we have the co-opting of classical style for the purposes of a new religion now, which is how it tends to go. When you don't have art forms of your own, you have to appropriate from other places, and that isn't inherently bad. It can be, but it's not inherently bad on its face. All right. So here's a sculptural example here, the Lao Kun and his sons, this Roman mythological story here. And where to begin? This one is really interesting. Once again, it's stone. Once again, we don't have it in color. A lot of these classical sculptures that we see as this glistening white marble now would originally have been painted. And that's important to note, because there's a very literal whitewashing of history that occurs when we don't keep that in consideration, right? So we have this very dramatic depiction of this. We've got a lot of different elements going on, a lot of windy, curvilinear elements here, especially with the snake. And as his sons are trying to save him, and he's, I believe the sons are like teenagers, right? But they look so much smaller in comparison to him. And it's all very naturalistic, but also idealized, right? Like these are the celebrities of their time. It's like they're photoshopped. That's what it is. When things are idealized, it's basically the equivalent of being photoshopped in our cultural context. All right. So this is a crucifixion mosaic from the Church of the Dormition in Daphne, Greece. So this is like an interesting style of Christian art here because of where it's at. It's more of kind of an Eastern Orthodox kind of tradition. But the crucifixion is not it's related to the Passion of the Christ theme that we see recurring, but it's not one you see as much because it's just very morbid. And we see, the blood falling down on the skull. We have the two Marys here, or this is John actually. This is Mother Mary, and then this is John the Baptist. But it's very simplified. We don't have a lot of gradation here, and keep in mind this is a mosaic, so you're using tiny little pieces of material to create the illusion of form. So they're only using like a very small gradation of light and dark here to make the difference. Ooh, I love these. So these are Merovingian, they're French, mid-6th century. And when you're looking at something that's not figurative, right, this is just artistic. The way you go about speaking of it has to be a little different, right, when we're talking about non-figurative art. So a way we could describe this would be more vertically emphasized. There are a lot of linear elements, but they tend to be more curvilinear than rectilinear, meaning straight lines versus like curved lines, or spirals versus squares, basically. And this gets associated with masculine and feminine energies, but we'll get into that later. You could discuss the gold. You could discuss the color of the gems. There's a lot of different ways you could go about this. It looks like there's like a little fish here too. But the way your eye is kind of led around these is really nice. And once again, these are just quick. I'm just quickly kind of analyzing these. There are a lot of really awesome videos on YouTube about how to do formal analysis from a more like step-by-step approach, and I can definitely include some of those in there. All right, and this is our last example here. So this is the bull leaping fresco from the Palace of Knossos in Crete, which is near Greece. Crete is generally considered part of Greece, but the precursors to the Greeks lived on these islands around Greece, and we have the Minoans, the Mycenaeans. There's a few different ones. So I believe this is a Minoan fresco, and it's related to the legend of the Minotaur. That's supposedly in the labyrinth and all of that. King Minos, right? Minoan, Minotaur, it's all related. But what we see here is really interesting because we have the typical color palette of Knossos and Crete with these really nice rectilinear elements juxtaposed right next to some curvilinear elements. It's framed very nicely, and we have these figures. This mosaic is very heavily restored. So what you see, the darker pieces are the original. What we're actually looking at is like a sideshow, basically, like a circus sideshow where these acrobats would come through, like troops of performers would come through and do these shows. And we see this guy literally leaping over this bull in some weird acrobatic feat. And what's really interesting is there's clearly a distinction in skin tone here, right? Like, that's obvious. And so we could make the deduction that this is an example of like intercultural interaction, because it looks like the troupe is even intercultural, which is interesting for the time period. All right. Like I said, you've got 4 handouts that I've attached here. I'm going to go ahead and throw the links for the videos on. I'll add some extra ones in here. I'm going to upload this PowerPoint file. And that's it. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm happy to talk more and direct you to more resources, but this was a really foundational part of starting this channel. So I don't want to just start doing it and you guys really have no conception of what it is that's even going on. So this is actually the lecture I give the first day of my classes, whether it's Intro to Art or Art History 1, Art History 2, whichever. This is first day, we go over the syllabus, and then we do this. So welcome to class, y'all. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate you.